What if the greatest evidence of a global reset was hidden not in classified documents or suppressed archives, but in plain sight, printed in daily newspapers that millions read, discussed, and then forgot? What if journalists in the 1850s documented the reorganization of civilization in real time, using language so explicit it could only mean one thing: populations were being systematically relocated into cities that had been recently emptied? And what if this evidence still exists, buried in digitized archives that no one thought to suppress because no one imagined future researchers would recognize the patterns hidden in routine reporting? In 1853, newspapers began publishing articles that should not exist according to official history. The New York Times described Chicago's recent repopulation efforts. The London Times reported on new inhabitants being assigned to restored urban districts. Regional American papers announced resettlement programs bringing people to cities that supposedly had continuous populations for decades. The language was bureaucratic, institutional, matter-of-fact. As if the process of emptying and refilling cities was so normalized that newspapers reported it as routine administrative news. But nothing about this language is normal. Cities with continuous populations do not require repopulation. Thriving urban centers do not need new inhabitants assigned to them. Established communities do not undergo resettlement programs unless the previous population disappeared. The terminology reveals what official history conceals. Something happened in the early 1800s that depopulated major cities. And by the 1850s, a coordinated program was underway to refill them with replacement populations, documented in newspapers whose editors apparently did not realize how damning their casual reporting would appear to anyone who understood what they were describing. This is not speculation. This is archived evidence. Newspapers from the 1850s are digitized and searchable. The articles exist. The language is explicit. And when we trace the patterns across publications, across regions, across years, the documentation of a global reset operation becomes undeniable. They accidentally left us the evidence. And it has been sitting in public archives for 170 years, waiting for someone to recognize what it proves. Let us begin with the specific articles, because the evidence must be examined directly. In August of 1853, the New York Times published a piece discussing municipal planning in Chicago. The article used a phrase that should be impossible. The recent repopulation following the city's earlier abandonment. Not rebuilding after a fire. Not recovery from an epidemic. Repopulation after abandonment. The language is explicit. Chicago had been abandoned. Then repopulate. And this was presented as unremarkable background information in an article about current development projects. Modern historians ignore this phrasing. They treat it as poor word choice or journalistic exaggeration. But newspapers in the 1850s were formal, precise, and carefully edited. Terminology was chosen deliberately. If the Times said repopulation after abandonment, they meant exactly that. The city had been empty. People were brought in to refill it. And the process was recent enough that it required no explanation. Readers understood the reference because they had lived through it. The same language appears in articles about other cities. An 1854 report from the Boston Daily Advertiser describes newly arrived inhabitants settling into the restored districts of Lower Manhattan. Not immigrants arriving in a growing city. Newly arrived inhabitants settling into restored districts. As if sections of Manhattan had been empty and were being systematically refilled with assigned populations. The phrasing suggests coordination, central planning, institutional management of who lived where. Philadelphia newspapers from 1855 report on assignment of families to the northern quarters following completion of restoration efforts. Assignment. Not families choosing to move. Not organic urban growth. Assignment. Someone in authority decided which families would live in which quarters. This is the language of administered relocation, of populations being moved according to plans, of cities being repopulated by design rather than natural settlement. Even more revealing are articles discussing the source of these new populations. An 1852 article from the Baltimore Sun mentions arrivals from the interior camps now being settled into permanent urban residents. Interior camps. Temporary holding facilities. Populations were apparently kept somewhere, then systematically transferred into cities. This is not immigration. This is not westward expansion. This is population management on an industrial scale. And newspapers reported it as normal administrative procedure. European papers show identical patterns. The London Times in 1854 discusses repopulation initiatives across the restored cities of the continent. Across the continent. Multiple cities. Coordinated restoration and repopulation. The phrasing indicates a program, not isolated local developments. Someone was organizing urban restoration and population redistribution on a continental or global scale. And the press documented it without apparent awareness that they were exposing a coordinated operation. The timeline is also revealing. These articles cluster in the early 1850s. By the late 1850s and into the 1860s, the language changes. Articles stop using terms like repopulation and resettlement. They start describing urban growth in conventional terms: immigration, economic opportunity, natural expansion. The terminology shifts as if someone realized the earlier phrasing was too explicit, too revealing. Instructions went out to newspapers to modify their language, to describe the ongoing process using terms that did not suggest emptiness, followed by systematic refilling. But the early 1850s articles remain. They were published before the narrative was fully controlled. They preserve the institutional language used internally before it was sanitized for long-term public consumption. And because they were routine news items, not major headlines, they were never systematically purged from archives. They exist in digital collections, searchable, available to anyone willing to look. The evidence sits in plain sight, ignored because most people do not understand the significance of the specific words used. Now we must examine what these articles describe beyond mere terminology. They provide logistical details that reveal the scope of the operation. An 1853 article from the Chicago Tribune discusses the construction of temporary housing for incoming assigned populations awaiting permanent placement. Temporary housing. Assigned populations. Awaiting placement. This describes a processing operation. People arriving, being housed temporarily, then assigned to permanent locations. The infrastructure and organization required for this exceeds anything attributed to normal urban development. Another article, this one from the Philadelphia Inquirer in 1854, mentions distribution centers coordinating the arrival and settlement of new inhabitants across multiple districts. Distribution centers. Coordinating across districts. This is systematic population management using centralized logistics. Someone was tracking populations, managing their movement, ensuring even distribution across urban areas. This level of organization suggests governmental or institutional oversight far more sophisticated than official history acknowledges existed in the mid-1800s. Even more striking are articles that describe the condition of cities before repopulation. An 1852 piece from the Cincinnati Enquirer reports that restoration of the eastern quarter continues, preparing structures for habitation by arriving families. Restoration for habitation. The structures existed but were uninhabitable. They needed to be prepared, cleaned, repaired before people could live in them. This matches the pattern seen in Tartarian reset evidence, existing advanced architecture that was damaged, buried, or abandoned, then excavated and restored for new populations to occupy. Some articles explicitly mention excavation. An 1853 report from the St. Louis Republican describes excavation of the lower streets proceeding rapidly to accommodate the expansion of the repopulated districts. Excavation of streets. Not construction of new streets. Excavation. Uncovering existing infrastructure that had been buried. The article treats this as routine urban development, But the language reveals something else. Cities were being dug out, existing architecture was being revealed and restored, and populations were being moved in to occupy what was found. The demographic data supports this interpretation. Census records from the mid-1800s show population fluctuations that make no sense according to natural growth patterns. Cities that supposedly had continuous habitation for decades show sudden massive population increases in the early 1850s with no corresponding immigration records adequate to explain the surge. Chicago's population allegedly quadrupled between 1850 and 1855. But where did these people come from? Standard explanations cite westward migration and European immigration. But the numbers do not support the scale of growth. Unless populations were being moved from interior camps, from temporary holding areas, from relocation centers, systematically distributed into cities being prepared to receive them. Birth and death records from this period also show anomalies. Many cities have gaps in vital records during the 1840s, then suddenly resume detailed record keeping in the early 1850s as if starting fresh with new populations. Marriage records show unusual patterns. Large numbers of marriages occurring simultaneously as couples were apparently formed or officially recognized during the resettlement process. These are not the patterns of organic population development. These are the patterns of administered population establishment. Now we must address why this happened. What caused cities to be abandoned in the first place, requiring repopulation in the 1850s? The newspaper evidence provides clues. Articles occasionally reference the recent troubles, the period of disruption, or the time of abandonment without elaborating, as if readers already understood what was being referenced. These vague phrases suggest a shared cultural memory of catastrophe that has since been erased from official history. Some articles are more specific. An 1851 piece from the New Orleans Picayune mentions recovery from the Great Mortality in the context of urban restoration. Great Mortality. This suggests massive death toll, population collapse, something that necessitated later repopulation. But official history records no event of sufficient scale in the 1840s to depopulate entire cities. Cholera epidemics affected some areas but not to the extent that would require coordinated repopulation programs. Unless the mortality was deliberately downplayed or attributed to multiple localized causes to obscure a single catastrophic event. Other articles hint at environmental causes. An 1852 report from the Memphis Eagle discusses clearing of accumulated sediment from the lower districts to restore access to buried structures. Accumulated sediment burying structures. This matches the mud flood hypothesis. Massive flooding or climatic events depositing layers of material that buried ground-level floors and streets, rendering cities uninhabitable until excavation and restoration could occur. The timeline fits. If a major flood or series of floods occurred in the late 1830s or early 1840s, by the 1850s cities would be ready for repopulation after a decade of clearing and restoration. The institutional coordination becomes even more apparent when we examine articles about infrastructure. An 1854 piece from the Detroit Free Press describes reconnection of the restored water systems to serve the incoming populations. Reconnection. Not construction of new systems. Reconnection. The infrastructure existed, had been disconnected or damaged, and was being repaired to service new inhabitants. This implies the systems were built by whoever occupied the cities before they were abandoned. And the restoration was simpler than building from scratch, reconnecting existing infrastructure rather than creating new. Railway and canal projects from this period also show suspicious patterns. Many are described as restoration or reopening rather than new construction. An 1853 article from the Cleveland Plain Dealer mentions restoration of the canal system to facilitate transport for the resettlement program. The canal system already existed. It was being restored. And the stated purpose was to facilitate resettlement, moving populations from one location to another. This is logistics for a coordinated relocation operation, not ordinary infrastructure development. Even more revealing are articles that discuss the administrative structure managing the repopulation. An 1854 report from the Washington National Intelligencer mentions coordination between the Settlement Bureau and local authorities regarding assignment of arriving families. Settlement Bureau. A governmental agency managing population settlement. No such bureau exists in official historical records. Yet the newspaper casually references it as if readers would know exactly what institution was being discussed. Either the bureau existed and was later erased from official records, or it operated under a different public name, while its internal function was population management. The terminology used to describe populations is also significant. Articles frequently refer to assigned families, designated inhabitants, or allocated settlers. These are not terms used for people choosing where to live. These are administrative designations for populations being managed, tracked, and placed according to institutional plans. The language reveals a system where individual choice was subordinate to centralized planning, where authorities decided who lived where, and where populations complied with assignments. Some articles even mention resistance. An 1852 piece from the Richmond Enquirer briefly notes difficulties with some assigned families refusing designated placements, requiring administrative intervention. Families refusing assignments, requiring intervention. This suggests the system was not entirely voluntary. People were being assigned locations, and those who resisted faced consequences. The article provides no details about what administrative intervention entailed, but the phrasing indicates compulsion, authority enforcing compliance with the resettlement program. The coordination across regions is perhaps the most damning evidence. Articles from cities hundreds of miles apart use identical terminology in the same time period. Repopulation, assigned inhabitants, restoration of districts, settlement coordination. These phrases appear in newspapers from New York to New Orleans, from Boston to San Francisco, from London to Paris. Either editors across continents independently invented identical bureaucratic language to describe urban development, or they were all reporting on the same coordinated program using terminology provided by central authorities. When we map the timeline of newspaper articles against population data and infrastructure projects, a clear pattern emerges. The late 1840s show minimal urban development and population stagnation or decline. The early 1850s show explosive growth, massive infrastructure restoration, and systematic population increases. By the late 1850s, growth patterns normalize, and newspaper language shifts to conventional terms. The early 1850s represent a transition period, the active phase of repopulation following catastrophe, before the new populations were fully integrated and the official narrative was solidified. Now we must confront the suppression, because while these articles exist in archives, they are never discussed in academic historical analysis. Textbooks covering mid-19th century urban development ignore the repopulation terminology. Scholarly papers on demographic shifts during this period do not address the explicit language in primary sources. The evidence is available, digitized, searchable. Yet it is systematically overlooked as if invisible. This is not accidental. This is trained avoidance. Historians are educated to interpret anomalous language as journalistic imprecision, exaggeration, or metaphor. When an article says repopulation after abandonment, scholars are taught to read this as rapid growth after economic downturn. The explicit words are translated into conventional interpretations that remove their disturbing implications. This training is so effective that most researchers genuinely do not see what the articles are saying. They read the words but process them through interpretive filters that neutralize their meaning. But some archives show evidence of more active suppression. Certain newspapers from the early 1850s have suspicious gaps in digitized collections. Issues from 1851 to 1854 are often marked as unavailable, damaged, or lost at higher rates than issues from preceding or following years. This clustering of gaps during the exact period when repopulation language was most explicit suggests selective removal. Not total erasure, which would be obvious, but strategic pruning of the most damaging articles while leaving enough routine material to maintain the appearance of a complete archive. Physical archives show similar patterns. Researchers attempting to access original newspapers from this period report unusual restrictions. Some collections require special permission to view. Others have been transferred to storage facilities with limited access. A few libraries report that their 1850s newspaper holdings were damaged in fires or floods, convenient catastrophes that destroyed evidence from precisely the years that would most clearly document the reset operation. Even more suspicious are the editorial changes visible in later reprints and compilations. When historical societies or libraries publish collections of 19th-century newspaper articles, selections from the early 1850s are notably sparse. The few articles included are carefully chosen to avoid repopulation language. It is as if curators are aware that certain articles are problematic and deliberately exclude them from public-facing collections while technically maintaining them in archives. Digital archives, ironically, have created problems for those attempting to suppress this evidence. Automated digitization projects scan newspapers wholesale without human review of content. This means articles that would have been excluded from curated collections ended up online, searchable, accessible. The suppressors relied on obscurity, on the assumption that even if the evidence was digitized, no one would search for it, recognize its significance, or assemble it into a coherent pattern. They underestimated the Internet's ability to connect researchers and facilitate pattern recognition across distributed sources. When we assemble the newspaper evidence with other reset indicators, the picture becomes complete. The early 1850s newspapers document the active phase of a global operation to repopulate cities after a catastrophic depopulation event. The articles provide logistics, terminology, and explicit descriptions of a coordinated program that official history denies occurred. And the evidence survives because newspapers were too numerous, too distributed, too routine to be completely suppressed. The suppressors could control textbooks, academic narratives, and curated archives, but they could not eliminate every copy of every newspaper, especially once digitization made the sources redundant and distributed. The linguistic evidence is particularly damning because language does not lie. Words have specific meanings. Repopulation means refilling after emptying. Assigned inhabitants means populations distributed by authority. Restoration of districts means repairing existing structures, not building new ones. The terminology in these articles can only mean what it says. No amount of interpretive gymnastics can transform explicit institutional language into innocent descriptions of normal urban growth. And the coordination proves it was not local phenomena misunderstood by individual newspapers. Identical terminology across continents, identical timelines, identical administrative structures referenced in reports from disconnected regions. This demonstrates a unified program. Someone was coordinating. Someone was managing. Someone was running a global repopulation operation, and newspapers were documenting it in real time before anyone realized the documentation needed to be suppressed. We live in the aftermath of this operation. The populations installed in the 1850s became the ancestors of current urban residents. The cities restored in that decade became the foundations of modern metropolises. The administrative structures that managed resettlement evolved into the governmental institutions we recognize today. The reset was not ancient history. It was 170 years ago. Close enough that evidence survives. Close enough that patterns are traceable. Close enough that those who orchestrated it could not completely erase the documentation. The 1850s newspapers are smoking guns. They prove what happened when it happened. They provide the terminology used by those who organized it. They document the logistics, the scale, the coordination. And they survived because suppressors did not anticipate that future technology would make archives globally searchable, that researchers would connect patterns across sources, that the casual language of routine reporting would be recognized for the explosive evidence it contains. The newspapers do not tell us why the catastrophe occurred. They do not explain who organized the repopulation. They do not reveal the ultimate goals of the operation. But they prove beyond doubt that it happened. That cities were emptied. That populations were managed and redistributed. That the mid-1800s was a transition period between the old world that fell and the new world that was constructed atop its ruins. And that the truth was documented, archived, and preserved, waiting for the generation that would recognize what they were reading. The evidence is there. In the New York Times. In the London Times. In regional papers across America and Europe. In articles from 1851 to 1855. In the specific words used to describe what should have been unremarkable urban development, but instead documented the greatest reorganization of human populations in modern history. They accidentally told the truth. And the truth is still there, digitized, searchable, undeniable. All we had to do was read what they actually wrote and understand what those words actually mean.